Thank you, Harry. And welcome everyone to this event. My name is Lee Findale. I am a partner and head of corporate communications at WA Communications. And welcome to our webinar, which is an attempt, shall we say, to look ahead to 2021 and what it may have in store for us. I'm very pleased today to say that we've got a very stellar lineup with us of speakers. We have Christopher Williams, business editor of the Sunday Telegraph, Poppy Trowbridge, former special advisor to Philip Hammond when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Michael Moore, Director General of the British Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, and also a former Cabinet Minister under the Coalition Government, Secretary of State for Scotland indeed. Before I turn to the speakers, I just wanted to say a few introductory remarks. First, I suppose it's safe to say predictions are something of a fool's game, particularly considering the year we've just been through. This time last year, we were just 3 days away from a general election that would see Boris Johnson deliver a resounding victory for the Conservative Party with a pledge to get Brexit done and breaching the red wall of Labour seats across the North of England and Midlands. No one, and I say no one, had any inkling that early reports from officials in Wuhan of a new coronavirus that affecting humans will turn the world upside down within a few months. So here we are, a year on, trying to read the tea leaves of what 2021 holds. Never afraid to take on a challenge, we at WA Communications, drawing on expertise across a wide variety of business and policy sectors, have put together a report looking ahead to the key challenges of 2021, which we will be publishing later today, and we will send a link to everyone. It will, as Harry said earlier, it will be linked to the recording of this event as well. In addition to the report that we put together, we have also conducted polling amongst MPs, businesses and the general public to ask them what they believe are the biggest challenges facing the country in 2021. Not surprisingly, there was consistency and agreement across the two biggest issues, which are the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on issues such as employment, or the challenge of unemployment we will see next year, and also managing Brexit, which was also seen as the other major challenge facing us. Indeed, it would be, I think, probably, if we would have taken this polling a couple of days later, that probably would have been pushed up even higher on the grounds that we are still seeking a deal and what that could look like as we enter the new year. And it'd be interesting to hear from the speakers what their views on that could be in terms of impacting on how next year plays out for us all. What is interesting about this polling findings is that just below that surface of those kind of top two issues, there is quite some disagreement between the various groups, between MPs, businesses and the general public. While the levelling up agenda is not surprisingly a key priority for Conservative MPs, it barely registers with business and general public, which is probably a sign yet again that the discussions in the bubble don't always play out in the discussions and views of the people in the country. Conversely, the rising cost of living is a major concern for the general public and indeed for businesses. This is especially the case for 25 to 34-year-olds, where it is actually alongside the economic recovery, the biggest issue they see facing the country in the next year. However, the rising cost of living didn't even register with MPs. And in fact, not a single Conservative MP responding to the poll said this was an issue for the country in the coming year. There are a number of other findings from that polling survey. We are releasing them today, and they do form part of the report we're doing. So with bearing some of this in mind in terms of what those issues are and what they may be, I'm going to turn now to our speakers and ask for them for their thoughts on where we see the challenges facing. 2021 has proven to be 2020 has proven to be the most unexpected of years. Will 2021 prove to be that as well? I'm going to turn first to Christopher Williams and for his thoughts, and then I'll turn to the two speakers before we take questions from the audience.
Morning. So I think next year there are some things that we do know, right? There's going to be a very rapid and large recovery in obvious places like hospitality and travel and those kinds of things. I think the interesting thing is when the tide comes back in, you know, what's changed, right? So the things that have changed are, it's become a cliche, but the trends that were already there have accelerated, and that's definitely true. And you just look at what's happened on the high street in the last 2 weeks. You know, that is a historic change, really, and for a lot of places, when people go back into their town centres next year, they're going to find there's not much there. I think that's a really serious question for the government to look at. You know, for businesses that aren't that weren't ready for this, and there's, you know, one of the remarkable things about this is how well businesses has coped. You know, lots of service industries, particularly, you know, if you've got an office-based job, we're all able to do them basically. And that's been a victory of digital technology. And, you know, I think investment in that is going to be a priority for a lot of businesses next year. You know, this kind of, the whole working from home idea is clearly here to stay in some form for a lot of businesses. Now, the question that then raises is at a systemic level is how much that affects commercial property and how much that in turn affects all our pensions and all the rest of it. And these are the things that are really unanswerable at the moment. I think I take on board that the levelling up is not on people's lips, but actually I do think it's kind of at the centre of the decisions that the government's got to make, because there's a very violent pull in two directions, right? That we've got this enormous national debt now, enormous deficit, and a political mandate that is to spend a lot of money, basically. And so you're going to see, I think that's going to be one of the big themes is the Tory party and the government being pulled in two directions. And there's a personal element to that as well, which is that Boris by instinct is a big spender and Rishi's clearly a fiscal conservative, right? So there's an interesting clash of ideas that's going to happen there. You know, Brexit clearly is today of all days on minds, but you know, I'm sort of slightly skeptical that whether it's a deal or no deal, it makes much difference to what January looks like. It's going to be very messy.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I'm now going to turn to Poppy for her thoughts.
Good morning, everyone. I would just make the point, Chris, that prime ministers are always big spenders and chancellors are always fiscally conservative. Such is life. But you've hit on a dynamic we have yet to see play out there. 2021. I used to really enjoy making predictions about what was to come. That's sort of part and parcel of following markets and being very interested in economics, which is my background. And 2020 has utterly ruined that for me in every way. So, you know, we heard the last of that phrase, known unknowns. I think it's making a comeback in 2021. But in lieu of making predictions for the new year, I think my new pastime is going to be trying to learn the lessons of what the evidence is telling us. And my takeaway from this year, as applied to next year, is that obviously the pandemic has had a huge impact on our lives, but for me, most notably on our physical lives, both in terms of our health concerns, our working arrangements, our ability to travel, all of these things that we thought we were in control of as individuals. And I think recognizing that we are in a shared environment in all three different aspects is going to be one of the most permanent changes in how we interact and transact and do business. And I raise this because I was deeply involved, not in any capacity responsible, but in another crisis, and that was the financial crisis, which, you know, was well over a decade now. And I have often had cause to compare and contrast this crisis with that crisis. And obviously there are a myriad of differences, but one of them that really strikes me is this difference between the physical impact of this crisis and the lack of a physical impact of the financial crisis. I mean, you know, those of us who went through it will remember it was a crash that we hadn't seen for 100 years. People genuinely thought the sky was falling. But now, with the comparison of this pandemic, we could see it was within an industry. It was about the digitization of a system that had accelerated beyond regulation, so the globalization of money. But it didn't actually impact physically upon us in any way. And I think that that is one change that we will now live with as humans on this planet permanently. And it will absolutely impact how policy is made, how businesses plan, and how businesses are created and grow and survive and thrive. And our physicality has been made very real to us at a point where we thought we were really, becoming this sort of superhuman, really good at digitized marketplaces and really focused on AI. I think that is an element that's been brought to us, brought to the fore. Chris, you made a point about change being accelerated, and I think that's absolutely right, especially in terms of how jobs will be affected and the digitization of some work. Now, we had long been talking about productivity enhancements and what they might do to the workforce, but actually, this is going to be nothing really happened for a decade on productivity, certainly within the UK context. This is going to be accelerated, and that is one thing I think we're going to see in evidence in 2021, the acceleration of the digitization of the workforce, and essentially that I would have called it the shift to more productive workforce, but that's probably not going to be the outcome. But what it will be is the first stage of that, which is culling of the jobs that we feared would have been lost slowly through that process had it happened without this global health pandemic. And then my final sort of prediction for 2021 for the UK and for business, let's say in Europe, but more widely, is that obviously the UK is going to have a new relationship with the world. And I think we've been obviously very distracted and we haven't really had time to think it through. Business has on a very practical level. But I think we haven't really experienced how that will change in terms of our reputation and relationship. And I think that is going to be quite a serious awakening for British business in many ways, for British government and for brand Britain, because we will be in a global marketplace and we will be getting live feedback on our perceived value in that global marketplace. And that's not something that's been it has not been the case up to this point. And then I'm just going to leave this sort of minor grenade with you. The other thing I think businesses will face in the new year, in both a macro sense and micro sense, is increased competition, very much from that point I just made about being sort of far more exposed commercially and in industry in the new year. But along with that, I think we're going to see a lot more red tape, regulation, and focus on supply chain or logistical and movement disruption. And I think there's a slight disconnect between the expectations of a global free trading Britain and the actual reality and the amount of regulation and red tape that we'll actually be subjected to. And I think that comes along with that scrutiny. And I think actually we are quite unprepared for that, whether we're talking about regulation of the tech sector or regulation in terms of environmental controls. I think the change that is to come will be met by the political class with increased regulation. It's a control mechanism. And I think maybe the expectation is that we will be freed from a lot of that. And I think it will actually be the opposite. So with those encouraging words, I will hand back to Lee, but also just to say that not only has business coped with the change, but it's also coped with the uncertainty. And I'm afraid that will be required for another 12 months to come from industry and from business as well, because if they can't cope with it, none of the rest of us can.
Many thanks, Poppy. I'm going to pass over to Michael now and for his introductory remarks, but I hope that he was able to draw upon his own experiences of being in cabinet in the attempt to recover from the 2010, in the 2010 government, 2015 government, but also his perhaps more recent experiences of representing one of our more important financial sectors to the UK. Michael, over to you then.
Thanks, Lee. And yeah, it's as Poppy and Christopher have been highlighting, there's some really immediate stuff here that is quite stark, and there's also some longer running trends that really bear thinking about, or as Poppy was saying, making sure we have tried to learn the correct lessons from what went before. And, you know, that echo of the shock of what was happening in the great financial crisis, the period that gave rise to the coalition in 2010, where one might argue the electorate were deeply uncertain as to what to do. They kind of thought they didn't want Labour to continue, but they weren't sure that the Conservatives on their own were the right answer. And, you know, we've now lived through. I mean, at the time as a participant, we thought we were living through one of the most extraordinary periods in British political history, and there would never be the like of it again. And I'm afraid it is all looking distinctly Vauxhall Conference compared to some of the Premier League politics we have witnessed in terms of the excitement and change, if we're allowed to be just a little bit detached from the reality and observing it. But the echoes that I would say is that in 2010, as we sat around the cabinet table, we were rightly obsessed with how on earth we're going to get growth back into the economy, because it was not looking healthy. The financial system didn't know where to turn, and absent massive state intervention in that sector, the crisis might have spiraled out of control. Now, that growth was stubborn. There was a Eurozone crisis going on. You know, whether we were out of the Eurozone didn't seem to matter. It was a big trading partner, and what was that going on? So there was a whole range of issues. And to be frank, there were some pretty lively discussions at that time about what was needed to do to get things going. And the state of regulation, so much else, became a great focus. One of the other great worries, however, was what was going to happen with unemployment. And indeed, youth unemployment and women's unemployment was a big focus of the time, because these did get very seriously out of kilter with the rest of it. But the overall unemployment figures and the rate didn't get quite near the worrying levels that we anticipated. Nevertheless, you know, the flexibility of the UK economy and everything else, you know, kicked in, but a lot of people took roles or took jobs on that were very different to what they'd had before. And we saw in the decade that followed, you know, the real term wages took a very, very long time to recover. And arguably, you know, that is still a legacy issue that different communities and areas of the country suffer today. And that links into that levelling up agenda that is still prevalent. People have genuinely been left behind. You know, how do we deal with all of that? So, you know, in the Chancellor's office and more broadly in government, of course, you know, the speed of the rebound and recovery, particularly in the most affected sectors of the economy in the new year, is going to be a really key focus. Does the unemployment level get up to the levels that were being projected by the Office for Budget Responsibility only a couple of weeks ago in the spending review? But also the fiscal gap. There is an unprecedented gap between the taxes and the spending, and as Poppy says, the appetite to spend has been quite clear. How that gap is filled is really important. Now, I think everybody gets that there are some manifesto commitments that are pretty challenging for the government to simply dispense with, and I don't imagine for a minute they'll do that. But where else one can raise the taxes will bring business into the forefront, and I think there'll be a careful balancing act for them to strike between making sure that the coffers begin to get filled at an appropriate level to keep markets happy and everything else on the one hand, but not you know, snuffing out the incentives and the encouragement to invest, which are going to be pretty important for the medium to longer term recovery of the economy. Other than that, as has been touched on already, so I'll not repeat it overly, I agree with Christopher's characterization of January. We'll be very, very lucky to avoid a messy month. The scale of change coming with Brexit, irrespective of the trade deal that is or isn't being agreed today, is substantial. Out of the customs union, out of the single market, so the regulatory frameworks change, the terms in which we trade are changing regardless. It does matter to get that trade deal, but we should recognize there's big change coming, and it's sounding a little bit pessimistic in terms of those touch points at borders. How well ready are we, and how well are businesses prepared for that? And in the last 5 years, I've spent a lot of time either in consultancy or here at the BVCA looking at that with member firms and businesses on the front line. And I think that's going to be quite an anxious period, at least at the start of the year. I think the levelling up agenda just can't be ignored. I think different parties call it different things. So I don't think there's anybody who'd possibly be opposed to the idea, but whether it registers as one of the big priorities will be a big test for the new year. And all of this against a background of all the mega trends that have been slowly or sometimes quite rapidly changing the way we live and so on. We've had the tech revolution underway now for some time. We mustn't forget that climate change is reshaping the way in which we think about the way we live our lives, and therefore what the role of business is in terms of responding to it or adapting to it on the one hand, or facilitating this switch. And I think that there's some quite exciting opportunities there. But perhaps working from home will become the new mega trend that doesn't get reversed. Yes, we'll be delighted to go back into offices and do a bit of commuting, maybe not as much as before, but things have changed pretty substantially, it seems to me, and how we'll adjust that, hopefully, will be a positive from what we've just been through in a very difficult year.
Many thanks, Michael, and thanks to both Poppy and Krista for their initial thoughts. And I'm going to move to questions. We do have a couple of come in through the Q&A box so far, and I would ask anyone else who has any questions to please use that in order to for the panelists. I will, however, take the kind of take the fact that I'm chair as an opportunity to get my questions in first, or at least one or two of my questions in first. To all panelists, and I'll go to you in order. We've talked about how you've all sort of mentioned how businesses are going to have to face challenges over this next year with Brexit and also with the economic recovery. And also we talked about how some businesses adapted very quickly, very well, depending on which sectors they were in, to the circumstances of this year. Is business prepared for next year? Now, I know we've seen all seen the adverts telling business leaders to make sure they're ready for Brexit. Or is business ready? And most specifically, Christopher, you mentioned services industries. Obviously, the services industry did cope with the move to working from home and the use of tech. Can it also cope with Brexit and the sudden changes to the way it operates with our single biggest trader? So I'm going to go to Christopher first, and then I'll go to the other two speakers, if that's okay.
Well, I think if there's a lesson of the last few years that I always say to business people when they ask me what's going on in politics is that volatility is now, political volatility is now a cost of doing business. And there was a period of maybe 3 decades where everything was nice and stable, and that allowed people to run sort of racy balance sheets and do things in a way where they could rely on the government being sort of a shade of grey or another. And things not changing very much. That's not the case anymore. And if any business is thinking, well, once Brexit's out of the way and the vaccine's out there, things will be much more stable, I don't think that's true. There's Scottish independence, there's God knows what. There's government changes on the continent. There's the new Biden administration. We don't know what that looks like. There's a whole load of things that, and of course there's Brexit. Which is a process, not an event. So I think that the main thing I think people need to take away from this, if they haven't already from the previous 4 years, is that you have to be more ready for volatility and more ready for change. And there are financial ways to do that, and there are technological ways to do that. One of the problems we have as a country is quite a short-termist culture in business. You know, if you take a story like the Huawei telecoms controversy, that in lots of ways is a result of a failure of our businesses and our government to encourage them to invest for the long term. So we lost our telecoms engineering base and then became reliant on China. And as China became a more threatening country, we had a problem. So I would hope that people will take a more long-term view of how they run their businesses and what they invest in. You know, there's a moment here where everyone has seen very starkly the value of science and engineering to a modern society, and you know, as we try and sort of reshape our economy over the next few years, I hope there's an emphasis on that, which requires long-term investment and a different attitude from the financial markets as well as from business leaders.
Thank you, Christopher. Poppy?
Are businesses ready? I don't know, but I know that business is usually more ready than the other groups that we're talking about, government and sort of the Gen Pop, as for lack of a better description. I have been seriously impressed and encouraged, and I do wish the political classes were paying a bit more attention at the way in which our businesses have dealt with this global health pandemic. They have taken on, in particular the services industry, they have taken on board technology to deal with the restrictions around movement. They have taken on board new public health restrictions, and they have done all of this with incredible uncertainty from one day to the next. So if that's any indication of whether business is prepared to cope with a really unpredictable, very volatile 2021, the answer is yes, absolutely. It is not helpful that they aren't provided with a bit more certainty from government. But I think Chris has explained to us why, because political volatility is now an issue as well. The only thing that can fill that gap is communication and cooperation, and that's where business and industry really must. Industry and business and government really must work together in the year ahead. And frankly, I believe that the Treasury and I believe that Rishi Sunak's team are very much understand how reliant they are going to be on cooperation from British business and British industry to get through the first 6 months of next year and beyond. And I raise that specifically. It may seem obvious that the Treasury is reliant on cooperation and leadership from business and actually very open to working with them and supporting them. But it isn't always the case. And I was part of an administration where business and industry and experts weren't always valued as highly as they should have been. And I think this is the year for business to get its own back and really lead the way. And I do think government, certainly Treasury and Rishi Sunak and his work as Chancellor and wherever he might end up next is very, very cognizant of that.
Thank you, Bobby. Michael? Michael, you're on mute.
Apologies, 9 months into this whole great digital transformation, I should have got the mastery of that one. I think Poppy has got the order right. You know, most business people are asking, does the business, is the state ready for what is coming? And given various NAO reports and others, you know, there are legitimate questions to be asked there. My worry from the business perspective is simply about bandwidth, because a lot of what went into preparation for Brexit, hard deadlines and potential cliff edge departures in the past before the withdrawal agreement was secured a year ago. A lot of whether it's stockpiling or the teams that were focused on that have been redirected in the last 9 months or so onto COVID, and the financial pressures in many businesses mean that there's not the luxury of the build-up of stocks. Although, as we hear, problems with ports in the UK at the moment, dealing with the arrival of the different types of stock and whether Honda can get their car manufacturing going again, we can see that there are already pressures in the logistics of the UK. So I think that that's again, to Christopher's point, a messy January beckons, unless much of this can be cleared very soon. But then there will be the next stage of this is then all the regulatory responsibilities sit here in the UK. And the big question for everybody, whether it's in financial services, is largely absent. In fact, so largely absent, it's really not in this trade deal at all. We've got some framework legislation going through at the moment. We've got consultations on how the regulators should evolve and do their business and where they should focus. But there's an awful lot more to do. Never mind, in terms of how we govern the UK market. Never mind building back bridges or developing new connections to the EU and to other parts of the world. So. Prepared for what, I guess, might be the question. Prepared for the immediacy of January, jury's out. For what comes after that, still early stages. And I would just echo what Poppy said about the need to have people in the room together, because the comprehension gap between business and politics from both sides, I've been in both ends of that spectrum, is worryingly wide and deep at times. And if ever there was a moment for us all to be trying to close it, it's now.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, so I'm going to now turn to questions from the floor. I do have a number of them already, and I will try and get through as many of them as I can. I'm going to start with a question that has come in from our attendees saying, reskilling our UK workforce, especially as it relates to digital technology, has been an ongoing topic for at least a decade. Does the panel believe that governments have got it right? And if not, what should the government do to accelerate progress? I'm going to turn to Poppy first on that, if that's okay.
Well, I will speak very personally from my experience whilst I was in government and what I'm observing now. I cannot, the proof will be in the pudding as to whether they've got it right. But I was in government at the end of a decade of trying to crack the productivity puzzle. And we knew that investment and education, or reskilling as you've called it, were crucial to that. And yet we, and I include, all of us thinking at the Treasury, but even the Bank of England who were looking at these issues, and many other thinkers around the subject as well, still couldn't really get to the crux of why productivity was so stagnant in the UK. And I believe that when we look back in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we will see this crisis as the accelerant to make these huge leaps in productivity. That is my hope, at least. The trouble is, in that process, part of that process is it also includes significant damage, is the only way I can really describe it. Massive job losses and extreme volatility within certain industries. And, the risk for us here in the UK is that's coming at a really awkward time, right? Brexit and a global health pandemic. And so I hope that the government will get it right. And I believe that this administration is talking about it in a way that suggests they get it more than previous administrations, and that they are determined to try and further that goal. Whether they manage to, I don't know. But I think, again, this is where business is going to have to come in, because there will be enormous pressure on industry and business to retain employees, to keep jobs. It is the #1 thing that the Treasury and the government care about. They want the jobs numbers to stay where they are. But part of that will also be, that will be a dead weight cost for a lot of businesses. And if there is a solution where some of that time can be used to reskill workers, which can then be redeployed within industries, within businesses, to better productivity results, well, then that's a win-win for everyone. And I suspect a program like that is going to require total coordination between central government and various different parts of industry. So that's how you could get it right. Whether that's what we get looking back in 5 years' time, I mean, I think we've all agreed we just can't predict at this point.
Thank you, Poppy. Michael, a number of your sorry, not all of your members, shall I say, is probably a key issue for them in terms of the businesses they invest in and own. Do you think that we're getting there in terms of reskilling?
I think the skilling and reskilling and the investment piece are absolutely essential to this. And I think Poppy's right to say that it's been a focus of recent years. Frankly, it's been a focus for the UK economy for decades, trying to get why is it that UK productivity has fallen behind. But what's been so exciting in recent times has been the way in which I look at where our venture capital members are spending their time and putting their money, and the spin outs, the growth agenda for a lot of these new businesses that are coming, whether it's in tech or healthcare or whatever. These are capitally intensive in terms of capital, and they're intensive in terms of the skills you need to succeed in them. And this is presumably the great opportunity to reinforce both, because we've got everything, all the tools in the toolbox are now in the hands of the Treasury, Number 10 and others, and it'd be great to see some of the very ambitious rhetoric that has been spelt out in recent times, backed up by the way the spending review is developed when it moves to the more traditional 3-year cycle, and also in terms of the shape of the budget in the spring. I think those will be key signals for business. I don't think there's any weakness of appetite for people to do the investing, but they do want to get talent. A lot of the time, again, we see this in all aspects of our industry. We've got a pretty mobile workforce that brings skills and other things into the UK and enriches what we do in the UK, but we also want to develop our own talent pools, and I think that can be done. But the signalling is one thing. The specific measures to back it up are things that I think all businesses will be watching very carefully in the after the turn of the year.
Thank you, Michael. Christopher?
I think the thing, I'll be slightly more pessimistic. I mean, any big technological shift is going to leave some people behind. It's just kind of what happens. The question is how you deal with it, and can you reskill those people? And the evidence so far is not brilliant on that. At the same time, the evidence of the government's understanding of the need to sort of lean into this and accelerate it is not good either. One of the few casualties of this spending round was the $5 billion that they had pledged to invest in rural broadband, right? So that's been cut. And if there's anything that this year should have taught you, is that our internet infrastructure is very important and needs investing in. At the same time, they're pressing ahead with HS2 at a time when no one's taking the train. So it's it's clearly it's not top of the agenda in government. That's obvious. The question is how bad it gets. I think at what point does COVID and this massive generational shift take unemployment to a level that causes real problems? And I think that's one of the big open questions of the next year. And I don't see any evidence personally of government having any ideas about that. There's a lot of sort of waffling, quite ignorant waffling from ministers about AI and stuff, that they clearly don't understand. They just like to be associated with it. And none of that really helps people who are at risk of losing their jobs.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm going to move to another question now. And I'm going to start with Michael. It was actually directed at you, but I will ask the other two for their own thoughts on it as well. It says, Michael, how much will business be targeted with taxes to refill coffers versus individuals?
Well, in the face of it, the government, through its manifesto, has ruled out some of the obvious places to raise taxes that would affect individuals in terms of income tax and VAT and the like. But the heavy lifting that corporation tax or capital taxes might do there is possibly insufficient to close that gap. I think what business will need to understand is what the government's thinking is about the speed at which it needs to close that gap. And clearly, I think there are slightly different views of that from the point of view, as has been remarked on already. The Chancellor being pretty small c conservative, more the fiscal hawk, as is traditional of chancellors, regardless of what they thought before they got in the building. You can't see the numbers and not think, I need to do something about this, versus he uses the term himself, the more boosterish tendencies of the Prime Minister, who will wish to unleash the country without any pain being inflicted. I think that the critical thing, as I mentioned before, is going to be the balance. I think there's an understanding across business and more generally that everybody's going to have to chip in here a bit, but it's about getting the balance right, making sure that in looking at what burdens of tax are put across the economy, we don't undermine the very thing we just talked about, which is the key to this, is investment in the economy, and that there's a very, very careful balance to be struck there, and obviously one we'll be watching very carefully in the new year.
Christopher, what's your thoughts on this?
I think I've got no idea what the future tax policy will be, but I think it's clear that there is a slightly more sophisticated thinking that seems to be starting to be happening about the difference between spending and investment in government. We had the boss of the OBR in the paper last week talking about changes to the fiscal rules to allow the whole balance sheet to be taken, assets as well as debts to be taken into account, which would allow a better view of how you invest in infrastructure and the things that actually do create long-term productivity and value in the economy. So I think everyone's going to have to pay. It's going to. This is the great question. This whole thing is where the pain is ultimately going to be fall and be shared. At the moment, it's still working its way through the dominoes of the economy. It's on individuals or consumer businesses, but as I sort of referred to earlier, it's going to get through to commercial property and to pensions and financial markets and the taxpayer. And the question is how much of that business is going to have to bear. At the moment, everyone is benefiting from massive public borrowing. That clearly can't last. So, I don't see the overall burden changing radically. It's just how there's clearly going to be reform of business rates and a rebalancing between digital and physical businesses. But the overall burden, I think, will be around about the same as where we are now.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. Poppy, you've been in the weeds on this during your time at the Treasury in terms of preparing for budgets and spending.
How you pay for them.
And how you pay for them. So how do you think they're going to pay for them?
It's linear, I think. Right now, in the immediate aftermath, the government's paying for it. And in more ways than one, they're literally paying for it. But the Conservatives have also paid for it reputationally because they've had to change their fiscal policy more or less, and they might have to go further, as both Chris and Michael have said, changing the rules to make it all seem like it was their plan all along. So in the immediate response, it's the government that pays for it. Then in the medium term, it's business that pays for it, and that might be through higher taxes or, for example, a delay to looking at revisions around business rates because it's not something the government has the capacity to do right now. I don't think there'll be massive business taxes in the short term, but business could still be asked to pay for it in a different way by, for example, keeping people on the books, keeping people in employment, making commitments around that they wouldn't do in normal times, if we can even use that term. And then in the long run, we pay for it and workers pay for it through our pensions, through our through wages, through salaries, through job security, and through essentially being made redundant in a changing workforce. And that's the sort of linear trajectory that I've observed, and I don't expect it to be any different this time. I would just say, in terms of paying the bill, we've only just paid off our World War II debt in 2015, and wages only recovered their pre-crisis level about a month before COVID really took in by something like 6 pence a week or something. Now we're talking about a very generic average of this, but this is a very long process, reckoning the bill on this. And as I think Chris was saying, each pillar has its part to play. Government first, business in the medium term, and all of us in the long term.
Fabulous, thank you very much. Moving on to a different issue, maybe trying to look at some of the other aspects at play next year. How can business take advantage of the new commitments by the government on addressing climate change and sustainability? Obviously, this is another major push from the government, as you know, in terms of green jobs and the opportunities that creates for Britain in its new place in the world. Where do you think this is heading? I'm going to turn to Christopher first, if that's okay.
Well, I think that it's clear the government sees this as an opportunity to do some fairly old-fashioned industrial policy. You know, they're trying to encourage new industries and investment, as I sort of harped on a bit about long-term investment in science and engineering. Now, businesses that are capable of doing that, that's great, and they should. You know, we've got some great assets in the country in terms of renewable manufacturing, and you know, BP and Shell are big players in energy, clearly, and have both made very serious commitments. We'll see how that goes. There's one of the worst things about our position in all this is as a country, we don't, despite being the windiest place in the world or something like that, I think we don't have none of the manufacturers of turbines are UK, and that sort of, for me, colours how far we've got to go on this. For businesses that aren't, you know, directly linked to the things that need to change, it's clear that the momentum behind this now is very strong, and there's really no value in resisting it anymore. Whether it's a boost for your business, I don't know. For a lot of people, you know, it's clearly another bit of red tape or another thing to worry about for people. But unfortunately, it's going to be a cost of doing business in the future. So, getting a handle on it now, and making sure it's built into the way you operate is you know, the businesses that do that are going to stand a better chance of navigating through it.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, again, you're muted again. Sorry.
So you don't hear me slurping my coffee. The point here is that, you know, the great opportunities are there, and we're seeing more and more businesses, more and more funds raised with a view to investing in the technology that will help people adapt, respond to the new demands from regulators and everything else. But, you know, when we consider as an industry the ESG agenda in its broader sense, so beyond simply environment, climate, and on to the other areas where society expects more of business, I mean, I think there's a basic truth that some people will be moved by the opportunity cost of a regulator coming after them, or red tape choking them, or whatever it is, and thinking, right, how do I get ahead of that and get it? And that's great. And I think there's now much greater understanding that this is this agenda is not going away anytime soon. And because the UK is next year going to host the COP26 talks, postponed through to November next year, you know, held in Glasgow in prospect, that's going to give a big focus on this. We've seen the Chancellor talking on this issue in recent times. We've seen the Prime Minister, you know, putting quite a lot of his own political capital into this too. So I think for business to ignore this agenda would be a massive mistake, because the direction of travel in terms of policy and regulation is pretty clear. But way more powerful is the way consumers are changing their expectations too. And we see that the way that consumers are looking harder at supply chains, consumers are looking harder at the overall impact of businesses on the environment elsewhere. That's changing a lot of behaviors too. And the investors are very closely aligned behind that. So whichever bit you look at, I think the agenda is inescapable. Some of it will be kind of reactive, right, slightly gritted teeth, adapting to it. I hope we'll see more and more people pivot to an embrace of the subject matter and then getting ahead of this, because never mind the public policy challenges of net zero and getting there as quickly as possible, there are going to be some big changes in specifics. You know, we're going to stop the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles in the UK, exclusively internal combustion engines, by 2030. That's not far away from the near future. And I think what business will need to then have a much greater voice on and say, right, if that's to be a reality, where are all the things that facilitate that? What's happening about charging networks for vehicles and for home charging in cities and all that kind of stuff? So really exciting agenda, fraught with challenges and difficulties, but not one we can avoid.
Thank you, Michael. Poppy?
I won't add too much, but just two observations. One, governments can change their mind on green agendas, in my experience, being loosely involved with the Conservative Party over the last 10 years. I do agree that things are here to, the change is here to stay to a further degree than it has been in the past. One of the points of evidence I would give in support of that is that not only do we know it's really truly part of the Prime Minister's agenda, but there is also a specialist unit set up in the Treasury now to measure the cost of moving towards net zero. And once there's a Treasury team devoted to it and they start crunching the numbers, and actually then that the rest of Whitehall is being forced to take this seriously. And there was an interesting outtake from that this morning where they have acknowledged what I think will be the challenge for business. So Michael and Christopher have talked about some of the opportunities. I think the challenge for business was echoed in this story from some of the number crunching done within the Treasury today, which is, whilst they were very optimistic about the long-term costs of moving to, say, net zero and better ESG standards, has come down significantly because the technology is getting better. And that's because the money is moving into the field and the innovation and investment is all, coming together there. That's the positive. The downside is there's very likely to be quite significant upfront costs, certainly for consumers. And obviously that could apply to business and industry as well. And this answers one of the other questions in the chat, Lee, about what people can, where I see why I think there'll be more regulation inadvertently applied. I think this is one area. If you've got big upfront costs and you're arguing over who takes the leap, you either regulate to have households change their boilers, or you incentivize households to change their boilers, for example. And I suspect with everything that the government's been through the last 18 months, or by the time we get around to it, 18 months, they will want to regulate people to make these changes rather than incentivize consumers or business through financial support.
Thank you. I'm going to try and combine a couple of the last questions because I'm conscious we've only got a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to turn to high politics a little bit, maybe. There could, we've already, I think all speakers have mentioned the fact that this, the balance between political mandate to spend and the enormous debt could create a lot of tension between Boris and Rishi. How could that play out in political terms over the coming year? And also, we have an opposition which perhaps is beginning to get its act together again under Keir Starmer. How can they continue to carve out space for themselves, considering where we are at this point? So I'm going to jump straight back to Poppy on that, and then just for like a 1 minute response, and then I ask the same from the other two speakers.
The Conservative Party has been changing its fiscal policy to be more to sort of eat into Labour territory for some time. So I'm actually not that optimistic that that's where that Labour is going to make any inroads. I know they're looking organised, but actually when it comes to spending, the policies are are almost sort of indistinguishable. And I think that was whether by conspiracy or cock-up, a very good move on the Conservative Party's front to do that. So it removed a point of difference there. And in my experience, you're always looking for ways to soften the rules to ensure that you're not left taking really big decisions on this. And I am rather pessimistic that there are going to be massive changes to policy to start to pay back what we owe, to return to traditional fiscal conservatism anytime soon. If I had to predict, I'd say end of this decade rather than before.
Okay, thank you, Poppy. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the opposition is playing a reasonably canny game at the moment. The action is all elsewhere. There's a lot of internal stuff that Keir Starmer's sorting out, fairly well documented, some of the difficulties he still has. Nevertheless, by just doing an old-fashioned hold the government to account on its performance, he's got plenty of opportunities, because the government, and irrespective of their political hue, they've got some of the most complex domestic challenges facing them that we've seen in peacetime. So the opportunity for mistakes is pretty large, and I think that if they continue to be wise in this respect, they will simply wait for performance not to match expectations, and delivery, particularly in these areas. I mean, I take Poppy's point about the moving into the kind of territory, policy territory and spending territory that allowed them to get the red wall seats a year ago. But those red wall seats are waiting for the oven ready or shovel ready or whatever ready projects they are to become real and deliver on the promises. And some of the polling recently suggested questions are being asked. So I think it will be pretty lively. And if Labour plays safety first for a little while longer, who knows what it will get. For the government, it's going to be pretty tense. But ultimately, in the end, winning the next election will be more important, I think, to the Prime Minister than going down as a fiscally prudent Prime Minister. So I think the tensions there will be something to behold, as we have seen, as Poppy reminded us, over many generations of politics.
Thank you, Michael. And final words, Christopher?
On Labour, I think that the one thing I'd say is they've got an opportunity to rebuild bridges with business. The Conservative relationship with business isn't brilliant still. They've got a lot to prove. So, and just by not being sort of overtly hostile to private enterprise, I think Keir Starmer can make some friends. And he presents very competent. So that'll is a good start for them compared to where they were. In terms of the government, I think next year the big event is going to be the spending review, clearly. But I think before that, you're going to see a reshuffle. There's some people, I think there'll be a sort of an influx of experience back into the cabinet in some key roles, including business secretary. I can't see Alok Sharma lasting there much longer. I think that'll be quite important. And then when the dynamics of the spending review will depend on some of the faces around the cabinet table. I think the Prime Minister's authority and ability to govern as a president has been completely destroyed this year. So he's going to have to go back to sort of cabinet deal making, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all our speakers for this, I think, quite a lively debate this morning. Thank you. I'm pleased to say that our report is ready to be downloaded, and I think links have been sent to all participants this morning. I'm also somewhat relieved to say that many of the things that our panelists said this morning do resonate with what we've read in the report, so we're not completely at odds with each other. Thank you very much for your time this morning, and again, thank you very much to our three speakers, Christopher, Michael and Poppy. Many thanks.
Thank you.